Picture this. You are standing in a darkened chamber lit by the dull orange glow of oil lamps, their smoke staining the marble ceiling black. The smell is unmistakable sweat, spiced wine left too long in bronze cups, and the faint acrid tang of human skin pressed against silk. The year is 54 AD, in the heart of imperial Rome. Behind the marble walls of the Palatine Hill, where the world believes emperors speak of law and conquest, another kind of ritual is unfolding, one of flesh, secrecy, and calculated danger. Before diving into these forgotten stories of lust, power, and blood, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below where are you listening from. The fact that we can uncover the darkest corners of history together, across time and oceans, is as astonishing as it is chilling. The Roman Empire in the mid-1st century prided itself on order. Laws inscribed on bronze tablets, ceremonies honoring Jupiter and Mars, the strict authority of the Senate. Yet beneath this thin skin of civility ran something older, wilder, and less controlled. Rome was a civilization that fed on conquest, where victory was celebrated with orgies of feasting and the humiliation of captives. Sexuality was not private nor sacred. It was weapon, currency, theatre. The philosopher Seneca wrote in disgust that the city is drowned in excess, where the body is bartered and the bed is the battlefield of ambition. This was the Rome of Emperor Claudius, an old, half-lame man whose stammer and timidity made him a strange figure on the throne. But history does not remember his decrees as much as it remembers his wife, Valeria Messalina. She was 20 years younger, raven-haired, with a reputation that even Roman chroniclers described as monstrous. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal, men who saw Rome in its rot, spoke of her name with a mixture of awe and horror. To them she was not merely a wife, she was a living symptom of a disease, a corruption born of imperial privilege. What made Messalina so dangerous was not only her appetite, though the sources describe it as insatiable, but the way she used sex as a lever of politics. The anthropological paradox of Rome was this. In public, the body of the emperor was sacrosanct, semi-divine, untouchable. But in private, the body of the empress could be turned into a theatre where alliances were sealed and enemies undone. Sacred and profane collapsed into one another, purity of the state resting on the filth of its bedchambers. Witnesses tell of the notorious contest that Messalina staged against a professional prostitute. According to Juvenal's Satire VI, she challenged the woman to see who could take the most lovers in a single night. The number Juvenal records is 25 men, each used and dismissed, before the empress, still unsated, demanded more. To later moralists, this was pornography used as evidence. To the people of Rome, it was terror, because every man she drew into her web was now compromised, owned, silenced. The horror here is not gore, it is corruption of the soul. In Roman thought, as in so many ancient cultures, the body was both vessel and battlefield. To surrender it recklessly was to pollute not only oneself, but the community. Yet Messalina turned this logic on its head. She polluted in order to control. Each act of excess was a chain fastened around another senator, another noble, another general. She made Rome's future dependent on her appetite. Tacitus writes with cold precision, Messalina, burning with a new and almost insane desire, compelled the nobility of Rome into shameful submission. Husbands gave up their wives, fathers their daughters, all under the compulsion of her will. These were not whispers in the streets, they were public facts, known and feared. To resist her was to risk exile or execution. To submit was to be owned forever. Imagine the atmosphere of those nights. A room draped in Tyrian purple cloth, lamps smoking with thick resin, the sound of distant music and the shuffle of sandals on marble floors. Senators and generals, men who commanded legions across the empire, reduced to trembling guests in the empress's private chambers. She was not merely indulging in vice, she was orchestrating submission, turning Rome's proudest men into participants in a ritual of humiliation that blurred pleasure with terror. This was the heart of the forbidden Roman bedroom secret, that the empire's stability was shaped not in the Senate nor on the battlefield, but in these darkened chambers where the empress bent men to her will. And as history would soon reveal, such power built on lust could not last forever. Picture this. You are in the vast marble halls of the Palatine Hill, where the echo of sandals on stone sounds like whispers in a tomb. Torches spit and hiss, their smoke trapped against the gilded ceilings. Somewhere in the distance, a lyre is plucked in monotonous rhythm, not for music but for timing, as if marking the steady pulse of a ritual. The year is still 54 AD, and Valeria Messalina is tightening her grip on Rome. Claudius, the emperor, is absent. His mind is often on treaties, aqueducts, or tedious games of dice. In truth, he was never truly present, even when seated at his throne. Age and infirmity made him slow, distracted, and easy to mislead. His wife knew this, and the court knew it too. It is here, in the gaps of his authority, that Messalina carved her empire not of marble, but of flesh. The historian Cassius Dio described Rome under Messalina as a city under siege, not by armies, but by her desires. He wrote, "The beds of matrons became her arsenal, the dowries of noble daughters her plunder. Each seduction was political. Each surrender she extracted was a confession of loyalty to her, not to Rome." Anthropologically, Rome had long blurred the sacred and the profane. Marriage was not a private bond but a public contract, a religious duty to the household gods. Fidelity was tied to civic virtue. Yet Messalina inverted this system. Infidelity became a ritual of power, a deliberate desecration of the sacred in order to bind men to her. It was a strategy of corruption, where filth itself was made useful. The horror deepened when Messalina turned from private indulgence to open spectacle. Suetonius and Juvenal both record her descent into Rome's brothels, disguised not at all convincingly, offering herself for coin like the lowest prostitute. But this was no mere disguise. It was an act of deliberate degradation. The Empress of Rome, wife of a living god, displayed herself in a public house of sex, her body for sale to anyone with a handful of copper. The sacred body of the empire's mother was dragged into filth, and by doing so, she declared that nothing, not law, not religion, not honor, was beyond her reach. Juvenal's line is cold. She, a royal whore, with nipples bare and golden hair covered in false scent, took her stand in the brothel, belly open for all. The Roman elite trembled not because she sinned, but because she revealed a terrible truth. If the empress herself could pollute the divine bed, then the boundary between order and chaos was already broken. Claudius, blinded by either willful ignorance or fear, did nothing. He dined with senators whose wives he knew were compromised. He signed decrees handed to him by men who had been inside the chambers of his wife. He allowed the empire's laws to be stained by the private rituals of his consort. For a time, this served him, because it bound Rome's nobility together in a silence of mutual shame. But silence rots, and the rot was spreading. The central act that would destroy her came in 48 AD, an act so reckless that even Rome, desensitized to vice, recoiled. Messalina, still married to Claudius, staged a full wedding ceremony with her lover, Gaius Silius. He was a senator, handsome, ambitious, and foolish enough to believe that bedding the empress might make him emperor. The sources are unanimous. The ceremony was real, attended by witnesses, with vows spoken aloud and sacrifices offered to the gods. It was not a secret affair. It was a declaration. Tacitus writes, "She celebrated a marriage with Silius as though Claudius had been removed from the world." The image is horrifying. The emperor of Rome, still alive, still ruling, was cuckolded in the most sacred of Roman rituals. The marriage altar, normally the site of vows that bound families and secured Rome's future, became a theatre of treason. The sacrificial smoke rose not to honor the gods but to mock them. From an anthropological view, this was the ultimate profanation. Marriage was the hinge between the divine and the human. To corrupt it while the emperor lived was to sever Rome's link to the gods themselves. It was an act of ritual regicide without a blade drawn, the symbolic murder of Claudius by his own wife. Imagine the scene. Senators in their white togas, pretending solemnity as the empress vows herself to another man. The marble altar glistening with the blood of a sacrificial ox, its smoke curling into the dark Roman sky. The chants of priests, trembling as they realize they are officiating not a wedding but a conspiracy. The crowd of slaves, prostitutes, and freedmen whispering that Rome itself had gone mad. When the news reached Claudius, he was feasting outside the city, oblivious as always. Sources differ on his reaction. Some say he was stunned into silence. Others that he laughed, thinking it a crude joke, but his advisors understood at once. This was not lust anymore. This was revolution staged in the bedroom. If Messalina could wed another man while her imperial husband lived, she could place Silius on the throne, claim legitimacy, and erase Claudius overnight. The horror was no longer confined to whispers of debauchery. It was political, existential. Rome itself was at stake. Picture this. You are standing in the Forum Romanum on a grey morning, the air damp with mist rolling in from the Tiber. The marble statues of gods and generals seem to glare down at the senators gathering in hushed clusters, their white togas stained with the sweat of fear. Rome has heard the whispers for years, but now the whispers are shouts. The empress has married another man while the emperor still lives. It is no longer scandal. It is treason. Claudius was returning from Ostia when his freedmen and advisors broke the news. Narcissus, his chief secretary, spoke bluntly. Messalina has taken a husband, Gaius Silius, in the sight of the gods, while you still live. Claudius, as Tacitus records, froze like a man struck by lightning. His stammer worsened. He asked again and again if it were true, as if repetition could turn treason into rumor. Narcissus insisted it was fact, witnessed, undeniable. The emperor's carriage rattled toward Rome. Around him the freedmen whispered, each with their own agenda. Some wanted swift punishment, others wanted delay. Narcissus knew hesitation would kill them all. He told Claudius plainly, "If you do not strike, you will be struck. If you do not kill, you will die." The words were not poetic. They were survival. Anthropologically, this moment marked the rupture of Rome's sacred political order. In Roman law, the emperor was pater patriae, the father of the state. If the emperor's wife could take another man, then the father had been symbolically castrated. Authority collapsed into ridicule. The empire itself, in the eyes of its people, became illegitimate. To restore cosmic balance, blood had to flow. Messalina, however, did not yet grasp the danger. Suetonius describes her celebrating with Silius in the gardens of Lucullus, drunk with victory, imagining herself mistress of Rome. They had summoned senators, signed petitions, begun preparing decrees as if Claudius were already dead. This was not lust, it was a coup. But Rome was shifting beneath their feet. Soldiers were whispering in the barracks, the Praetorian Guard weighing loyalty against survival. Slaves ran through the streets with messages, carrying fragments of rumor that multiplied into panic. The gods had been mocked, the emperor betrayed, and the city demanded cleansing. When Claudius entered the Praetorian camp that evening, escorted by Narcissus, he was still trembling. He stuttered before the soldiers, unable to speak. Narcissus spoke for him. "Your emperor lives, but his wife has wedded another. If you will not defend him, she will make Silius your lord." The soldiers, insulted by the suggestion that an adulterer might command them, roared their loyalty to Claudius. Their swords flashed in the torchlight like fangs. At once, the tide turned. Orders were issued. Gaius Silius was dragged from the Forum in chains. Tacitus says he asked for no trial, no delay. He demanded a swift death, knowing the dishonor was already unbearable. He was executed that same day, his body discarded like refuse, the blood staining the stones where senators walked. But Messalina was not yet dead. She fled to the gardens of Lucullus, vast estates with fountains, cypress trees, and shaded porticos. There she fell to her knees before her children, Octavia and Britannicus, begging them to plead with their father. She sent messages to Claudius, insisting she had been deceived, that it was a jest, a madness. In her desperation, she offered not defiance, but humiliation. Yet Rome's anthropology left no space for mercy. In the Roman worldview, betrayal by a wife was pollution of the highest order. To let it stand was to invite chaos, famine, and divine wrath. The sacred boundary of marriage had been turned into a theatre of treason. Only blood could cleanse it. Claudius, wavering as always, nearly faltered. He dined quietly, muttering that perhaps his wife might be allowed to plead her case. It was Narcissus who acted. He knew that hesitation would give Messalina time to charm her way back into power, to seduce, to manipulate. While Claudius drank himself into stupor, Narcissus gave the order in his name. The empress must die that night. Imagine the moment. Messalina in the gardens, pacing beneath the cypress trees, her silk robes torn, her hair loose, her face streaked with tears. A squad of soldiers approaches, their armor gleaming faintly in the torchlight. The sound of their sandals on gravel grows louder, a drumbeat of finality. She tries to appeal to them, invoking her children, her titles, her past, but soldiers are not moved by words. They have their orders. Tacitus, cold as ever, records that she faltered, unable to end her own life. The blade was placed in her trembling hands, but her courage failed. It was the officer at her side who struck, driving steel into the flesh that had once ensnared half of Rome. Her blood darkened the earth of Lucullus's gardens, seeping into the soil where fountains still trickled and night insects still sang. The empress, once mistress of Rome, was reduced to a corpse in the dirt. Anthropologically, this was the restoration of balance. The polluted body had been removed, the sacrilege washed away in blood, but the horror lingered. The Romans did not forget that their empire had nearly been toppled not by armies or barbarians, but by the bedchamber of a single woman. The boundary between sacred and profane had collapsed, and for a brief, terrifying moment, all of Rome had stared into the abyss of chaos. Claudius, when told of her death, asked simply for more wine. He neither wept nor raged. His silence was the silence of a man who had lost not just a wife, but the illusion of control. Rome had survived, but it had been humiliated. Picture this. The body of Valeria Messalina lies cooling in the gardens of Lucullus. The night air is damp, carrying the mingled scent of blood, crushed cypress needles, and the faint perfume of wine spilled from broken cups. Her lifeless form, once the most feared in Rome, is left unceremoniously in the dirt until servants drag it away. There is no funeral with honors, no mourning procession. She is erased as if she never existed. Yet the city remembers. Rome always remembers. The year is still 48 AD, but Rome has already shifted. News of Messalina's execution spreads faster than fire across the Subura district, where taverns overflow with gossip. Senators breathe easier, some relieved, others trembling at how close they came to ruin. Prostitutes whisper her name in mockery. Mothers clutch their daughters tighter. The empire has rid itself of a dangerous empress, but the stain she left cannot be washed away so easily. Tacitus, with the precision of a blade, notes that after her death, Claudius gave no sign of grief. He ordered her name erased from records, her statues pulled down, her images smashed. It was damnatio memoriae, the Roman ritual of unremembering, where the state attempted to annihilate a person's very existence. Yet such erasure reveals its own failure, for if Messalina were truly forgotten, why would her name still ring through the pages of every chronicler who came after? Anthropologically, the destruction of her memory is telling. In Rome, the body and name were intertwined. To strip away monuments and deface portraits was not simply punishment, it was mutilation of the soul. The Romans believed that memory was a form of immortality. To be remembered was to live beyond death. To be erased was to die twice. In this sense, Rome killed Messalina's flesh and then killed her spirit. But still she survived in rumor, satire, and fear-proof that pollution cannot be buried so easily. The consequences reached far beyond her grave. Claudius, though emperor, was weakened. He had been humiliated, deceived, cuckolded in the most public and sacrilegious way possible. Rome's citizens mocked him as a fool, a man too blind to see treason in his own bed. The Senate whispered that the empire had nearly fallen because its ruler could not control his wife. Political rivals sharpened their knives, waiting for the next crack to split the imperial facade. The most chilling consequence was the precedent. Rome now knew that the bedroom was a battlefield. Sexuality, once a private indulgence, had been revealed as a weapon of statecraft, capable of binding senators, destroying generals, and nearly replacing an emperor. Messalina had proved that the profane could overturn the sacred, that the flesh could corrupt the body politic. Future emperors and empresses would remember her lesson well and would wield the bed as a throne of power. Juvenal's satirical venom makes this clear. Messalina, with her sleepless lust, unmans Rome itself. He was not exaggerating. Her acts did not merely shame individuals, they shamed the state, reducing the empire to a stage for one woman's desires. The The fear was not of lust itself. Rome had long tolerated indulgence, but of lust weaponized, turned into treason. This is why her execution was swift, and why her memory was condemned. Yet even in death, her presence haunted. Claudius soon remarried, choosing Agrippina, the younger niece of Augustus, mother of Nero, and a woman whose ambition would surpass even Messalina's. Here lies the terrible irony. In trying to erase the stain of one deadly mistress, Rome invited another. Agrippina studied Messalina's downfall carefully. Where Messalina had been reckless, Agrippina was calculated. Where Messalina flaunted her lust, Agrippina cloaked hers in ceremony and law. But both operated on the same truth that in Rome, the line between sacred matrimony and profane corruption was perilously thin. Anthropologically, this cycle reveals Rome's deepest anxiety, that women at the center of power could destabilize the entire state. To the Roman mind, a wife was supposed to guard the household gods, to maintain purity within the domus. But when that role was twisted, when the guardian of the sacred hearth became the corrupter of it, the household itself, and by extension the empire, was poisoned. Messalina became the embodiment of that fear. The guardian turned destroyer, the sacred made filthy. Imagine the senators months later, seated in the Curia, debating laws with empty faces, while glancing nervously at the imperial throne. They had survived Messalina, but at what cost? Many of them had lain with her, sworn themselves to her, betrayed their own vows in her chambers. Each law they now passed carried the shadow of their own humiliation. They had been reduced to puppets once, and they knew it could happen again. For Rome's common citizens, the story became grotesque entertainment. Tales of Messalina's contests, her brothel appearances, and her false marriage spread through the streets like carnival gossip. But beneath the laughter was dread. If the empress herself could play the whore, what did that say about the divine order of the empire? If the mother of Rome could be defiled, could Rome itself be saved? The aftermath was not only political but psychological. Messalina's reign of lust left Rome more paranoid, more suspicious of the women within the palace walls. Every empress who followed was judged against her shadow. Some tried to embody chastity, parading their modesty as political theatre. Others embraced ambition, risking comparison. But none could escape the memory of Messalina. She had carved a scar into Rome's soul, a scar that even damnatio memoriae could not heal. Claudius continued his reign until his death in 54 AD, poisoned, most believe, by Agrippina to secure her son Nero's throne. By then, Messalina's story had already become legend, a tale whispered by chroniclers, priests, and satirists as a warning of what happens when the private body becomes the stage for public ruin. Picture this. The Palatine Hill is silent, its marble corridors washed in the pale light of dawn. The echoes of Messalina's fall still linger like smoke, though her body has long been carried away. Rome breathes again, yet it breathes uneasily. Every senator, every soldier, every citizen who whispered her name in fear or lust now walks through the city knowing how close the empire came to being undone not by foreign legions, but by the secret rituals of the bedchamber. The Roman historian Tacitus closes his account of her with words that seem almost reluctant, as if language itself cannot contain the horror of what unfolded. He writes of her desperate pleas, her cowardice at the end, and the silence of her husband who did nothing to save her. But beneath his dry sentences lies a truth that chills across the centuries. Rome's fate was determined not by law or war, but by desire left unchecked. Anthropologically, Messalina's story embodies the collapse between purity and filth, the sacred and the profane. In Roman religion, the household and marriage were not private matters but the very foundation of civic order. The lares, the household gods, guarded the hearth because the hearth was Rome itself in miniature. To defile marriage was to wound the cosmos. Messalina did not merely break vows. She transformed the sacred bond into a weapon of corruption, contaminating not just her home but the empire's very soul. The horror lies not in gore but in inversion. A queen of Rome competing with prostitutes, the empress of the world selling herself for coins, a wife marrying another man while her divine husband lived. These are images that unsettled Romans, precisely because they overturned the cosmic script. The roles were reversed, the order broken, the sacred mocked. When this boundary dissolved, so too did Rome's sense of invulnerability. After her death, Rome tried to forget. Statues smashed, names chiseled away, memories condemned. Yet the damnatio memoriae failed. Instead of erasing, it immortalized her. By trying to bury the pollution, Rome ensured it would fester in history. Messalina became the archetype of the deadly empress, her name a byword for lust, treason, and corruption for centuries. Her shadow stretched forward into the reign of Agrippina, into the madness of Nero, into the paranoia of later emperors who executed wives, sisters, and daughters on suspicion alone. The palace became not a home, but a cage of fear. Men and women alike understood that sexuality in Rome was never private, it was public danger, a weapon sharper than the gladius, capable of unmaking emperors. Imagine, centuries later, a monk in a dim scriptorium copying Tacitus's words by candlelight. His quill scratches across parchment, preserving the story of Messalina. Outside, barbarians raid the frontiers and Rome crumbles, yet her tale endures. Why? Because it is not merely Roman, it is human. It is a story of power corrupted by appetite, of the sacred mocked by the profane, of a society undone by its own excess. Anthropology teaches us that every culture wrestles with the tension between purity and filth, body and soul. When boundaries are clear, society thrives. When they collapse, chaos seeps in. Messalina represents that collapse in its most grotesque form. She weaponized intimacy, turned pleasure into domination, turned the marriage bed into a political execution ground. Rome's horror was that the profane was no longer outside the temple, it had entered the sanctuary itself. And what of us? The timeless warning of Messalina is not confined to marble ruins. Every age faces its own forms of corruption, its own temptations to blur the sacred and the profane. Our scandals may not involve empresses competing with prostitutes in Roman brothels, but the principle remains. When power is tied to appetite, when private corruption becomes public governance, societies fracture. The fall is never sudden. It begins in the shadows, in secrets dismissed as harmless, until the rot spreads to the core. So, when we look back at Messalina, we should not laugh at Rome's decadence or dismiss her as a grotesque relic. We should see a mirror that shows how quickly desire can turn to domination, how swiftly the sacred can be defiled, how easily order can collapse into chaos. The Romans were terrified not because she was unique, but because she revealed a truth they already knew. The empire was not invincible, it was as fragile as flesh. Picture this one last time. A garden at night, cypress trees standing like dark sentinels, a woman's blood soaking into the earth. Soldiers walk away, leaving silence behind them. The empire continues, but it carries a wound that will never close. Messalina is dead, but her ghost remains in the chronicles of historians, in the nightmares of emperors, and in the timeless reminder that when power and lust entwine, civilizations bleed. Before you leave, remember, history is not just marble and dust. It is flesh, fear, and forgotten horrors. If you want more journeys into the shadows of the past, consider subscribing, and tell me in the comments, what do you think Rome feared more? The barbarians at its gates, or the monsters it created within its own walls?